Welcome back to the great and spacious building. I'm your host, Dr. Wayne Denton, and today we are continuing our deep dive into the lives of the women who married Joseph Smith. So first off, I want to apologize for not being here, not posting videos the last couple of weeks. I've been dealing with some sort of sickness. I'm not sure what was going on, but I truly couldn't get through 5 to 10 minutes without hacking up a lung. So I'm just glad to be back here recording and hopefully, knock on some wood, that doesn't happen today. So today we are setting the clock back. We're leaving the swamps of Nauvoo, traveling to the rolling hills of Ohio, specifically in the early 1830s, while the Saints are in Kirtland. We're going to talk about a young woman named Fanny Alger. Now, before we begin, we have to address the elephant in the room, or rather the asterisks in the room. If you look at a list of Joseph Smith's wives, some will place Fanny Alger on there. Usually she sits toward the top, usually the second behind Emma, depending on who you ask. But she almost always has to come with a giant historical footnote attached to her names. To some historians, faithful and otherwise, Fanny Alger is the first plural wife, the proto-wife, if you will. The woman with whom Joseph Smith first attempted to restore the ancient order of Abraham, as he put it. To others, myself included, and Oliver Cowdery, Joseph's right-hand man at the time, what happened between Joseph and Fanny wasn't a marriage at all. So, which is it? Was this the holy beginning of a celestial principle? Or was it a domestic scandal that nearly tore the early church apart? Today we're going to look at the evidence, the rumors, and the wild stories involving barns, dry goods boxes, and bargains between men. But most importantly, we're going to try to find Fanny, the teenage girl at the center of a theological hurricane. Fanny Alger was born in September 1816 in Massachusetts. She moved with her family to the Kirtland, Ohio area around 1830, right when Mormonism was exploding onto the scene. Her father, Samuel, was a carpenter, and her mother, Clarissa, was a Hancock, a family name that's going to be very important in a few minutes. In the early 1830s, the Alger family joined the church. And as was common in the 19th century, young women often went into service in the homes of wealthier or more prominent neighbors. Fanny Alger was no exception. By the time she was 16, she was living in the Joseph Smith household, likely working as a hired girl or a maid. Let's set the scene here. You have Joseph Smith, 27 years old, charismatic, translating the Bible, receiving revelations, and building a distinct new society. And you have Fanny, 16 years old, described by Joseph's friend Benjamin Johnson as a very nice and comely, a young woman who everyone seemed partial because of her amiable character. This is the classic setup that we will see repeated again and again and again later in Nauvoo. The prophet and the teenage girl living under his roof. It's a proximity that breeds familiarity. And in this case, it bred a theology that would change everything to come. Now, why polygamy and why then? To understand this, we have to look at what Joseph was doing in the early 1830s. He was working on an inspired revision of the Bible. He was deep in the Old Testament, reading about Abraham, Jacob, David, and Solomon. These were the great patriarchs, the friends of God, and they all had one thing in common: a lot of wives. According to later testimony from Joseph Bates Noble, the doctrine of celestial marriage was revealed to Joseph while he was engaged in this translation work. The logic was simple, if revolutionary. If this is the restoration of all things, we have to restore all things. You can't just bring back baptism and prophecy. You have to bring back the patriarchal family structure. Plus, there's the Book of Mormon. Now, usually people cite the Book of Mormon to argue against polygamy because the prophet Jacob condemns it pretty harshly, but there is a loophole in Jacob chapter 2, verse 30. And I quote, "For if I will, saith the Lord of hosts, raise up seed unto me, I will command my people. Otherwise they shall hearken unto these things." End quote. So the rule is monogamy, unless God needs to raise up seed. And in 1833, Joseph apparently decided it was time to raise up seed. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and frankly jarring accounts in Mormon history. It comes from the autobiography of Mosiah Hancock, the son of Levi Hancock. Levi was Fanny's uncle, her mother's brother. Now, a disclaimer on this source. Mosiah wrote this down in 1896, reporting what his father Levi had told him years earlier. So this is not contemporary. This leads to a great deal of polygamy denial that is going on in the ether right now. But it has to be said, this is a late reminiscence. But it provides a level of detail that fits the pattern of Joseph's later proposals so perfectly that some historians, have taken it very seriously. Here's the story that Mosiah tells. Levi Hancock, Fanny's uncle, was in love. He wanted to marry a woman named Clarissa Reed, but Levi was a loyal follower of the prophet, and he felt he shouldn't make a move without checking in with headquarters. So Joseph Smith takes Levi aside and says something that sounds less like a religious commandment and more like a high-stakes trade. Joseph says, "Brother Levi, I want to make a bargain with you. If you will get Fanny Alger for me for a wife, you may have Clarissa Reed. I love Fanny." Let's pause and take a little breath of feminism here. The idea of "I want to make a bargain." In the history of bad romantic openers, this is right up there. But look at the dynamics. This is what anthropologists call the exchange of women. Women are treated as currency or social glue to bond men together. Joseph isn't proposing to Fanny directly, he's proposing to her uncle. He's saying, "You help me secure this asset, and I'll authorize you to secure that asset." A true quid pro quo. Levi, being a faithful elder, says, "Of course I will." Joseph sends him on a mission not to preach the gospel, but to secure the girl. Levi goes to Fanny's father, Samuel. Samuel, perhaps realizing this is above his pay grade, says, "Go talk to the old woman about it." That would be Fanny's mother, Clarissa. Levi goes to his sister, Clarissa, and she says, "Go and talk to Fanny. It will be all right with me." Finally, the chain of command trickles down to the actual person involved. Levi goes to 16-year-old Fanny and says, "Fanny, Brother Joseph the prophet loves you and wishes you for a wife. Will you be his wife?" And Fanny says, "I will, Levi." Now we have to look at this "I will." Was it romantic? Was it the prophet of God is asking me and I'm terrified to say no? We don't know. Mosiah Hancock says Joseph loved Fanny, but he didn't tell her that himself. He sent her uncle to do it. Levi takes Fanny to Joseph and says, "Brother Joseph, I have been successful in my mission." Then, according to the account, Levi performed a marriage ceremony, repeating the words as Joseph dictated them to him. And just like that, the bargain was complete. Levi got to marry Clarissa Reed, and Joseph got Fanny Alger. So they're married, or sealed as we later call it, or something. It's early 1833, but there's one person who was definitely not invited to the wedding. We talked about her in my last video, the first wife, the OG, Emma Smith. Joseph's legal wife, the elect lady, knew nothing about this. Fanny was living in her house, helping with the chores, likely taking care of her children, and Joseph was secretly married to her, or at least something else was going on. This is where the story shifts from a theological experiment to an absolute domestic thriller. There are a few versions of how Emma found out, and none of them are pretty. The most sensational version comes from William McClellan, an early apostle who later broke with Joseph. He wrote a letter to Joseph's son years later, claiming that one night Emma missed Joseph and Fanny. She went looking for them. She went to the barn, and there, looking through a crack in the door, she saw them. McClellan's phrasing is blunt. He says that she saw the transaction. Now, whether it happened in a barn or whether Emma simply noticed that Fanny was pregnant, as implied by Chauncey Webb in another account, that really explains the transaction now, doesn't it? The result was nuclear. Emma was furious. Anne Eliza Young, who later wrote a famous expose on polygamy, claimed that Emma turned Fanny out of the house in the night. Imagine the scene. You are Joseph Smith. You have had possibly multiple transactions. You've just restored the ancient order of the patriarchs. You have made a bargain with Levi Hancock, and now your wife is throwing your new plural wife out in the street, and the neighbors are starting to talk. It's a mess. It was such a mess that Joseph had to call in Oliver Cowdery to help calm Emma down. But Oliver didn't really help much. He saw the whole thing as a disaster. Later, when he was estranged from Joseph, he wrote a letter describing the incident as a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. Note the word choice, affair, not marriage, not sealing. To Cowdery and to a great deal in the community, this looked like adultery. The fallout from the Fanny Alger relationship was massive. It wasn't just domestic drama, it threatened the credibility of the entire church. Rumors were flying around Kirtland. People were whispering that the prophet was involved with the hired girl. To do damage control, the church took a drastic step. In August 1835, W. Phelps and Oliver Cowdery prepared an article on marriage to be included in the Doctrine and Covenants. This article stated in no uncertain terms, I quote, "Inasmuch as the Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife," end quote. This statement was canonized. It was scripture. And it was a direct response to the rumors about Fanny Alger. It was a public denial of the very thing Joseph had privately begun to practice. If it wasn't, then it was an affair. This is a really tough place for church apologists to be in. This created a pattern that would last for decades. The public denial and the private practice. It's a tragic ambiguity that defined Mormonism for half a century. You have a people who value honesty, led by men who feel compelled by God to lie about their marriages. But let's go back to Fanny. She's been kicked out of the Smith home. She's living with relatives. The apostates in Kirtland are using her as a weapon against Joseph. They want her to testify against him. This brings us to the second cinematic moment in the Mosiah Hancock account. The anti-Joseph faction in Kirtland apparently got hold of Fanny. They confined her in an upper room of the Kirtland Temple, of all places. They were determined to have her testify about her relationship with the prophet. Joseph, realizing he is cornered, goes to his trusty fixer, Levi Hancock. He says, "Brother Levi, what can be done?" Levi, who is apparently an action hero in his son's retelling, springs into action. There's a wagon and a dry goods box sitting near the temple. Levi climbs up, gains access to the windowsill, and gets Fanny out of the temple. He puts her on his horse, jumps on behind her, or maybe she's behind him. It's quite the chaotic scene, and they flee into the night. They ride 45 miles to New Lyme, Ohio, to get her away from the people who wanted to expose the marriage. It's a daring escape. It's dramatic. It involves a temple, a horse chase, a secret bride. If Hollywood ever makes a movie about this, this is the third act set piece. So what happened to Fanny? This is where the story takes a turn that is both sad and strangely empowering. In September 1836, the Alger family left Kirtland. They were moving west like good saints, but they stopped in Indiana for a while. And there, Fanny met a man. His name was Solomon Custer. He was a grocer. He wasn't a Mormon. He wasn't a polygamist. He was just a guy in Dublin, Indiana. We don't know how they met. We don't know the courtship. But on November 16th, 1836, a local justice of the peace married Solomon Custer and Miss Fanny Alger. Think about what this means. Fanny had been the first wife of the new dispensation, possibly, or an affair. She had been sealed to the prophet of the restoration, or it was an affair. She had been part of a cosmic, eternal priesthood drama, or it was an affair. And she traded it all for a grocer in Indiana. Again, this all leads me to lean more into the idea that this is an affair. If there is all this theological weight behind this union between Joseph and Fanny, then this really doesn't make sense. When her family eventually packed up to move on to Missouri and later to Utah, Fanny stayed behind. She chose Solomon. She chose monogamy. She chose a life where she wasn't hiding in barns or climbing out of temple windows. She went on to have 9 children with Solomon. They named their sons Franklin and Lafayette, patriotic, secular names, not biblical ones. She lived the rest of her life in Indiana, far away from the Great Basin Kingdom that her former husband's successor, Brigham Young, would build. Years later, after Joseph Smith was dead, Fanny's brother, Benjamin Johnson, asked her about her relationship with the prophet. He wanted to know the truth. He wanted the details. Fanny's response was brief, cryptic, and incredibly dignified. She simply said, and I quote, "This is all a matter of my own, and I have nothing to communicate," end quote. She refused to be a witness for either side. She didn't write an expose like Annalisa Young. She didn't sign affidavits for the church like many of the other wives would do later in Utah. She kept her life her own. To the church in Utah, she was a figure of history, the first plural wife. To her neighbors in Indiana, she was just Mrs. Custer, the grocer's wife. She died in 1889, outliving Joseph Smith by 45 years. Finishing this up from a feminist perspective, really sending the power into Fanny's story, her story is complicated. On one hand, she looks like the ultimate victim. She was a teenager, a servant in the home of a powerful man. She was traded in a bargain between her uncle and the prophet. She was expelled by a jealous first wife. She was essentially a pawn in a theological game played by men. This is all awful. But we also have to look at the end of her story, which does not cancel out any of the horror that is the earlier part of her story. In the end, she exercised the ultimate agency. She walked away. She rejected the celestial kingdom offered by Joseph Smith and found her own happiness in the secular world. She refused to let her identity be defined by her teenage marriage or affair to the prophet. When pressed for details, she claimed ownership of her own history, saying that this was a matter of her own. In a system designed to collect women like jewels in a crown, Fanny Alger managed to pry herself loose and live a life on her own terms. However, even though Fanny left, her shadow loomed over Nauvoo, which was to come. The Fanny Alger affair or marriage or sealing created the template for what was to come. 4 parts here. 1, Joseph always identifies a target, a woman living in the Smith household or closely associated with it, maybe a close friend of the family. 2, we see the method developed for Joseph's future proposals, a secret proposal often framed by a commandment or a requirement for salvation, sometimes involving male relatives or intermediaries, but there's always guilt laid here. 3rd, we see a conflict. Emma Smith finds out, explodes in rage, demanding the removal of a plural wife. Emma does not get in line behind this throughout the rest of Joseph Smith's life. And 4, expulsion. Young women that are being attached to Joseph Smith, either theologically or via sexual relationships, being sent away to avoid scandal for Smith, to avoid embarrassment for Emma. But what we see are these women being cast out of the family that is growing. We'll see this pattern repeat itself with the Partridge sisters. We'll see it with the Lawrence sisters. We'll also see it with Eliza R. Snow. Joseph learned from the Fanny experience, but he didn't learn to stop. He learned to be quieter. He learned that he needed a theology that was robust enough to withstand the dirty, nasty, filthy accusations of men like Oliver Cowdery. He learned that if he was going to build a harem of the faithful, he needed to make sure the bargains he struck were binding for eternity. Fanny Alger is the asterisk at the beginning of this list. She represents the messy, human, possibly sexual, possibly spiritual, possibly just adulterous, but definitely chaotic start of Mormon polygamy. She's the girl who climbed out of the window and rode away from history only to be dragged back into it by historians and theologians trying to make sense of a prophet who claimed to receive commands from God to break the hearts of women. Until next time, this is the Great and Spacious Building. Join us next week as we move forward to a woman who managed to be the wife of a martyr, the wife of a high counselor, and the wife of the prophet, all at the same time. We're going to be talking about Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris Smith, the woman who proves that in early Mormonism, till death do us part was just a suggestion. Until then, thanks for watching today. Like this video, subscribe to the channel if you aren't already, and join us next week. Until then, have a great day.